quiet fringe of Coconino National Forest, where untamed wilderness embraces the edge of civilization, Sarah Miller's life took an utterly unexpected turn. She had brought home Buster, a rescued bobcat deemed simply unreleasable to the wild. As a dedicated wildlife rehabilitation specialist, Sarah deeply understood the delicate, often challenging balance between revering wild nature and providing necessary care. Her young daughter, Daisy, now shared their home not just with Sarah, but with Buster, the bobcat, whose primal instincts remained ever present, a subtle undercurrent beneath his surprisingly gentle demeanor. But then, on one fateful, sun-drenched afternoon, when Sarah stepped away for just a fleeting 60 seconds, everything changed. A strange, jarring sound from the backyard. A desperate, choked cry, rushing back. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. As she saw the yard wasn't as she had left it. What transpired in that impossibly brief moment would challenge every single thing Sarah thought she knew about wild animals, about the fierce, undeniable power of maternal instinct, and about the extraordinary, unlooked-for depths of unexpected love. This, friends, is a story of boundaries crossed, trust earned in the most improbable of ways, and a sacrifice that would forever, irrevocably, change the very meaning of family. Before we dive deep into this incredible tale, please hit that like button and make absolutely sure you're subscribed if you haven't already. And definitely ring that notification bell so you won't miss any new stories we share. The late afternoon sun, a molten gold, cast long stretching shadows across the yard of the modest ranch house. Perfectly nestled at the very edge of the Coconino National Forest in northern Arizona, Sarah Miller stood at the kitchen sink, vigorously scrubbing stubborn dirt from beneath her fingernails after an afternoon happily spent tending to her burgeoning vegetable garden. Through the window, a pane of glass separating her from the potential wild, she watched her 1-year-old daughter, Daisy, sitting contentedly on a bright blanket in their securely fenced backyard, babbling sweet nonsense to herself as she meticulously examined a colorful plastic toy. Nearby, stretched out languidly in a patch of dappled sunlight, was Buster, their most unusual, most extraordinary family member. The young male bobcat's tawny, heavily spotted coat gleamed like burnished copper in the warm sunshine. His distinctive tufted ears occasionally twitching, acutely listening to distant sounds only he could possibly hear. His very presence in their home was the direct result of a confluence of circumstances Sarah could never, in a million years, have possibly imagined just 6 months earlier. Sarah hadn't planned on adopting a wild animal. Her entire adult life had been dedicated to working as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, pouring her heart and soul into healing injured animals with the ultimate goal of returning them, healthy and whole, to their natural habitats. That was precisely how she'd first encountered Buster, a severely malnourished and badly injured bobcat kitten, brought to the northern Arizona Wildlife Sanctuary, where she volunteered 3 days a week. He'd been tragically found trapped in an illegal snare, his right front paw horrifically mangled and deeply infected. The wildlife veterinarians had initially doubted he would even survive the night. But Buster, against all odds, had proven to be an incredible fighter. After multiple grueling surgeries, he had pulled through, though the permanent damage to his paw meant he would never, ever be able to hunt effectively in the wild. As a heartbreaking result, Buster was deemed absolutely unreleasable, a permanent captive. Sarah had developed a deep, almost inexplicable bond with the young bobcat during his lengthy rehabilitation. Unlike most wild animals that, quite rightly, maintained a healthy fear of humans despite prolonged contact. Buster had displayed an unusual, almost perplexing temperament. Cautious, yes, but not truly fearful. Observant, always, but never aggressive. When the center faced painful budget cuts and desperately needed to find permanent placements for some of their educational animals, Sarah had made the incredibly difficult, emotionally taxing decision to apply for the special wildlife rehabilitation permit that would legally allow her to give Buster a permanent, loving home. The permitting process had been unbelievably rigorous, requiring multiple home inspections, extensive documentation of Sarah's vast experience with wild felines, and the expensive construction of a secure, robust outdoor enclosure. But 3 months ago, Buster had finally, truly come home with her. The transition hadn't been entirely without challenges, of course, but he had adapted to his new, strange environment with remarkable, almost surprising ease. What had utterly surprised Sarah the most, though, was Buster's gentle curiosity around Daisy. The bobcat initially gave the toddler a wide berth, maintaining a safe distance, but over the weeks, he'd grown visibly more comfortable, sometimes watching her play from a distance of several feet. Sarah, naturally, never left them unsupervised. Of course, despite his remarkably good temperament, Buster was still, undeniably, a wild animal. A predator with powerful natural instincts that could never be fully, completely domesticated. Sarah reached for a dish towel, her hands slightly damp, to dry her hands. Glancing once more at the peaceful, idyllic backyard scene, she remembered she needed to quickly grab the laundry from the dryer in the adjacent utility room, a task that would take less than a single minute. Daisy was happily, completely occupied, and Buster was dozing peacefully in the sun, his typical, predictable afternoon routine. "It'll be fine," she murmured to herself, trying to quell a faint, irrational flicker of unease. Just 60 seconds. Sarah turned away from the window, a sense of normalcy settling over her. She walked briskly to the utility room, the familiar scent of warm, clean clothes filling the air. She pulled the soft garments from the dryer, folding them neatly into the waiting basket. Her thoughts, momentarily relaxed, drifted to dinner preparations and the upcoming weekend visit from her mother. The ordinary, comforting rhythms of life had a strange way of normalizing even the most utterly unusual circumstances, like, say, sharing your home with a bobcat. A strange, sharp noise from the backyard violently interrupted her thoughts. A low, guttural sound. A sound she instantly, terrifyingly, recognized as Buster's warning call. Sarah's heart quickened instantly, a jolt of pure adrenaline shooting through her veins. She dropped the shirt she'd been folding as if it were suddenly on fire and raced back toward the kitchen. Through the window, her eyes scanning frantically, she could no longer see Daisy on her blanket. Pure, unadulterated panic surged through her body, a cold, suffocating wave, as she burst through the back door, her eyes wildly, desperately searching the yard. What she saw next stopped her breath entirely. Buster had Daisy. He had her by the back of her tiny overalls, dragging her rapidly across the yard, away from something, toward the safety of the house. The bobcat's movements were urgent, frantic even, but incredibly, miraculously careful. His powerful jaws held the fabric firmly, securely, without even touching Daisy's delicate skin. The toddler wasn't crying. She seemed more surprised, wide-eyed, than truly frightened, her little hands instinctively grabbing at the grass as she was pulled along. "Buster, no!" Emily screamed, her voice raw with terror and disbelief, rushing toward them. The bobcat instantly released Daisy and swayed on his feet, his body tense, turning to face something. something at the very edge of the blanket where Daisy had been sitting just moments before. That's when Sarah saw it. A rattlesnake, coiled, lethally poised and ready to strike again. Its distinctive, terrifying rattling sound now finally registered in her stunned consciousness. Buster collapsed onto his side, his body slumping, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A small, dark trickle of blood matted the fur on his front leg. In that horrifying, crystal-clear moment, Sarah understood with absolute certainty what had happened. The snake must have approached where Daisy was playing. Buster had seen the imminent, deadly danger. He had instinctively moved Daisy away from it, putting himself directly in harm's way. Getting bitten in the process, the horrifying realization sent a cold, icy wave of fear crashing through Sarah's body, immediately followed by the hot, urgent rush of adrenaline. She scooped up Daisy, who had finally started to cry, a bewildered, frightened sound, quickly checking her tiny body for any signs of injury. Finding none, a wave of shaky relief washing over her, Sarah placed her in the portable playpen on the covered porch, well away from the snake, well away from any potential danger. Then, grabbing a long-handled garden hoe that leaned against the house, a tool suddenly transformed into a weapon, she carefully, cautiously approached the rattlesnake, which remained defiantly poised defensively near Lily's blanket. Sarah had dealt with rattlesnakes before. Living at the forest's edge made such terrifying encounters practically inevitable. With practiced, trembling movements, she used the hoe to guide the agitated snake into a large plastic storage bin she kept specifically for this purpose, securing the lid with shaking hands. She would release it far, far from the house later. But right now, Buster needed immediate, life-saving attention. The bobcat lay where he had fallen, his beautiful golden eyes glazed with pain, his breathing rapid and shallow. The bite was clearly on his front leg, where the fur was already beginning to swell ominously around two distinct puncture marks. Sarah knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that time was absolutely critical with venomous snake bites, even for a robust, seemingly strong, wild animal like Buster. Dr. Adams at the wildlife clinic was 40 minutes away. Sarah grabbed her phone from her pocket, her fingers fumbling slightly, and frantically dialed his number as she ran, her heart pounding, to the garage for a large pet carrier. "Sarah," Dr. Adams answered on the second ring, his voice calm, professional. "What's up?" "Buster has been bitten by a rattlesnake," Sarah explained, her voice tight, strained, thick with urgency and fear. "He was protecting Daisy. I'm bringing him in right now." "I'll prepare the antivenom," Dr. Adams replied without a flicker of hesitation, his tone reassuring. "Try to keep him calm and limit his movement. The more he moves, the faster the venom spreads." Sarah ended the call, her mind racing, and returned to Buster's side with the carrier. The bobcat weighed nearly 30 pounds, not enormous by wild bobcat standards, but still a significant challenge to move safely, especially in his current, critical condition. She spread a blanket beside him and gently, carefully, rolled him onto it, using it as a makeshift stretcher to carefully slide him into the carrier. Buster offered no resistance, an incredibly worrying sign. In the 6 months she'd known him, he had never been this docile, this compliant. Even during his most severe illness at the rehabilitation center, he'd maintained a wild animal's natural, healthy wariness. Now, he simply watched her with pain-dulled, unseeing eyes. After securing Buster in the carrier, Sarah retrieved Daisy from the playpen, the toddler still a little teary-eyed, and quickly strapped her into her car seat in the back of the SUV. The carrier with Buster went on the passenger seat, where Sarah could desperately keep a watchful eye on him during the agonizing drive. "Hang on, Buster," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she backed out of the driveway. "Just hang on." The drive to the wildlife clinic passed in a blur of desperate worry and suffocating fear. Sarah divided her attention frantically between the road, the rearview mirror where she could see Daisy, thankfully, chewing contentedly on a teething toy, and the carrier beside her where Buster's breathing grew increasingly labored, increasingly shallow. The relationship between Sarah and Buster had always been complicated, layered. She deeply respected his wild nature and never, not for a second, harbored illusions that he was simply a pet. Yet, their connection transcended the usual defined boundaries between humans and wild animals. She had nursed him back from the very brink of death. And now, incredibly, unbelievably, he had put himself in grave harm's way to protect her daughter. "Why did you do that, you silly cat?" she murmured, tears stinging her eyes, blurring her vision. "That's not how this is supposed to work." The wildlife clinic finally came into view. A low, practical building set back slightly from the main road. Dr. Adams was waiting outside as Sarah pulled up, a gurney ready to transport Buster inside. "He's deteriorating," Sarah said, her voice tight with suppressed panic as she flung open the passenger door. "The bite is on his right front leg, and there's significant, frightening, swelling." "Dr. Adams nodded grimly, helping her transfer the carrier to the gurney. "Let's get him inside. Rattlesnake venom is primarily hemotoxic. It affects the blood and tissues. The good news is, we have plenty of anti-venom on hand." Sarah followed, clutching Daisy tightly in her arms, the toddler unusually quiet, as if sensing the profound gravity of the terrifying situation. Inside the examination room, Dr. Adams and his assistant worked with swift, practiced efficiency to assess Buster's critical condition, administering fluids and carefully, expertly, injecting anti-venom near the bite site. "The next 12 hours will be absolutely critical," Dr. Adams explained, adjusting an IV drip, his gaze serious. "We'll need to monitor him very closely for signs of anaphylaxis or other adverse reactions to the anti-venom. I'd like to keep him overnight, at a minimum." Emily nodded, bouncing Lily gently on her hip. "Of course, whatever he needs." Dr. Adams glanced at Daisy, then back at Sarah, his expression thoughtful, contemplative. "You said he was bitten while protecting your daughter, yes?" Sarah recounted the terrifying scene she had witnessed. Buster dragging Daisy away from the coiled snake, then collapsing after apparently being bitten. "Remarkable," Dr. Adams mused, shaking his head slightly in wonder. "Protective behavior toward humans, especially children, isn't unheard of in domesticated animals like dogs. But it's highly, incredibly unusual in a wild species like a bobcat, even one that's been habituated to humans." He checked Buster's vital signs again, a look of deep respect on his face. "Animals constantly surprise us with their complexity, don't they?" Sarah looked down at Buster's still, unconscious form. The memory of the fierce urgency in his movements as he pulled Daisy to safety burned into her mind. "They certainly do," she whispered. After ensuring that Buster was stable, Sarah reluctantly prepared to leave. She needed to get Daisy home for dinner and bedtime, and there was nothing more, heartbreakingly, she could do at the clinic. Dr. Adams promised to call with updates throughout the long, anxious night. The house felt strangely, eerily empty without Buster's quiet presence. As Sarah went through the familiar motions of the evening routine, feeding Daisy, giving her a warm bath, reading her a beloved bedtime story, her thoughts continually, relentlessly, returned to the Bobcat, fighting for his life at the clinic. She checked her phone obsessively, her heart jumping at every notification, waiting, praying for news. Dr. Adams called shortly after 9 o'clock. "He's responding well to the antivenom," he reported, his voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. "His vitals have stabilized, and the swelling hasn't increased in the past 2 hours. I'm cautiously optimistic." Sarah exhaled a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding, a shaky, relieved sound. "Oh, thank God. That's wonderful news." "He's not out of the woods yet," Dr. Adams cautioned gently, tempering her relief. "But if he continues improving overnight, you might be able to bring him home tomorrow afternoon." After hanging up, Sarah walked out to the back porch and stared into the inky darkness of the yard. The empty patch of grass where Buster usually lounged seemed to amplify his absence, his quiet void. How quickly the wild bobcat had become an integral, indispensable part of their lives, and not merely as an exotic, fascinating presence, but as a fierce, unexpected guardian who had proven himself more devoted, more courageous than anyone could have possibly expected. Sarah slept fitfully that night, tossing and turning, waking frequently to check on Daisy and to see if there were any messages, any updates from Dr. Adams. By morning, the updates continued to be positive, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Buster was awake. The swelling had visibly begun to subside, and his blood work showed improving kidney function, a crucial indicator that his body was effectively processing the venom without permanent damage. By early afternoon, Sarah received the call she'd been waiting for with bated breath. Buster was ready to come home. She quickly arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, to watch Daisy while she made the quick trip to the clinic. Dr. Adams met her in the examination room, where Buster lay in a large kennel, looking tired, yes, but alert, his golden eyes clear and focused. His right front leg was bandaged, and an IV catheter remained, taped carefully in place. "He's made a remarkable recovery," Dr. Adams said, opening the kennel door to check the bandage, a look of genuine admiration on his face. "I've removed the IV since he's drinking well on his own now. The tissue damage around the bite will continue to heal over the next week or so, and I've prescribed oral antibiotics to prevent secondary infection." He handed Sarah a bottle of pills. "These need to be given twice daily with food." Sarah laughed softly, a sound of pure relief mixed with amusement. "Easier said than done with a bobcat." Dr. Adams smiled warmly. "I have faith in your abilities, Sarah. You've accomplished more challenging feats of wildlife rehabilitation than this." Together, they gently transferred Buster to Sarah's carrier for the journey home. The bobcat was subdued but watchful, his natural weariness, his wild reserve, slowly returning as his strength improved. During the drive home, Sarah found herself talking to Buster, something she rarely did despite their close, unusual relationship. She had always, meticulously, maintained professional boundaries with the wild animals in her care, consciously avoiding excessive anthropomorphism. "You know, you've completely, utterly upended my understanding of wild animal behavior," she told him, glancing at the carrier beside her. "What you did for Daisy, that's not something that fits neatly into any wildlife management textbook I've ever read." Buster shifted slightly in the carrier, his eyes fixed on her. Sarah had no illusions that he understood her words, not in a human sense. but there was an unmistakable intelligence, a depth in his gaze that had always set him apart from other wild animals she had rehabilitated. When they arrived home, Mrs. Peterson greeted them at the door with Daisy happily in her arms. The elderly woman had been initially skeptical, even a little fearful about Sarah's unusual house guest, but had gradually, surprisingly, accepted Buster's presence. "How's our hero doing?" she asked, peering at the carrier with a newfound curiosity. "On the mend," Sarah replied, setting the carrier down gently in the living room. "Thank you so much for watching, Daisy." "My pleasure, dear. That's quite an extraordinary animal you've got there." Mrs. Peterson handed Daisy over to Sarah, her expression thoughtful. Not many creatures would put themselves in harm's way for a human child. After Mrs. Peterson left, a quiet settled over the house. Sarah opened the carrier door and stepped back, giving Buster the space he needed to emerge at his own pace. The bobcat remained inside for several minutes, cautiously assessing his surroundings before finally, slowly, stepping out, favoring his injured leg slightly. Daisy, who had been watching the entire process with wide, fascinated eyes from Sarah's arms, let out a delighted squeal and pointed, a chubby finger extended. "Buster, Buster!" It was the very first time she had clearly, unmistakably said his name, and Sarah felt a rush of overwhelming emotion, a mix of love, relief, and profound wonder. "That's right, sweetie. Buster is home." She set Daisy down gently in her playpen, and the toddler immediately pulled herself up to standing, babbling excitedly, directly at the bobcat. Buster approached slowly, cautiously, sniffing the air, then settled on the floor a few feet from the playpen, his golden eyes fixed intently on Daisy. Sarah watched the silent, extraordinary exchange between child and wildcat, marveling at the improbable, almost impossible bond that had somehow, miraculously, formed. There was no scientific explanation that could adequately explain why Buster had risked his life to protect Daisy from the rattlesnake. Wild animals acted primarily from instinct, from survival, not the complex, nuanced emotional reasoning that might drive a human or a domestic dog to perform a heroic act. Yet, there was simply no denying the undeniable reality of what had happened. Perhaps there were aspects of animal consciousness, depths of connection, that remained far beyond human understanding, transcending conventional, accepted explanations. The following days established a new, quiet routine. Buster spent most of his time resting indoors as he recovered, initially reluctant to put weight on his injured leg. Sarah administered his antibiotics, cleverly hidden in small pieces of chicken, which the bobcat accepted with minimal suspicion, his wild instincts seemingly overridden by his need to heal. A week after the terrifying incident, Sarah sat on the back porch, a sense of peace settling over her, watching Daisy play happily in a shallow kiddie pool, while Buster lounged nearby, his bandage now removed to reveal pink, healing skin where the snake bite had been. The familiar sound of a car in the driveway announced the arrival of her mother, Helen, who had driven up from Phoenix for her monthly visit. Helen emerged from her car, carrying a shopping bag and wearing an expression of polite trepidation that Sarah recognized all too well. Her mother had never fully, truly approved of Buster's presence in the household, viewing it as an unnecessary, unacceptable risk, despite Sarah's extensive professional qualifications and experience. "Hello, dear," Helen called, approaching cautiously, her eyes, despite herself, fixed on Buster. "How is everyone doing?" Sarah rose to greet her mother with a warm hug, a smile on her face. "We're all well, Mom. Buster is recovering nicely from his snake bite." Helen's eyebrows shot up in surprise, in shock. Snake bite? What happened? As they settled on the porch with glasses of iced tea, Sarah, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and relief, recounted the harrowing events of the previous week. The rattlesnake's sudden, terrifying appearance, Buster's immediate, courageous intervention, and his subsequent, remarkable recovery. Helen listened with increasing astonishment, her initial trepidation replaced by disbelief and wonder. So he actually dragged Daisy away from the snake? She asked, glancing at Buster with a completely new consideration in her eyes. And got bitten protecting her? Yes, Sarah confirmed, her gaze resting on the bobcat. Dr. Adams said it's extremely unusual behavior for a wild animal, even one that's been rehabilitated. Helen was silent for a long moment, watching as Daisy splashed happily in her pool under Sarah's watchful, ever-present eye. Buster remained in his spot, seemingly dozing, but with one golden eye occasionally opening to track the toddler's movements. A silent, vigilant guardian. I've been wrong about him, Helen finally admitted, her voice quiet, reflective. I was so certain that keeping a wild predator around Daisy was irresponsible, dangerous, but... She shook her head slowly, a look of wonder on her face. I never, ever considered he might actually protect her. Sarah smiled, knowing how incredibly difficult it was for her mother to reconsider a firmly held position. He's unique, Mom. I've worked with hundreds of wild animals, and I've never encountered one quite like Buster. He maintains his wild nature in most ways, absolutely. But there's something different, something profound about how he relates to us. To Daisy especially. Later that evening, after Daisy had been bathed and gently tucked into bed, Sarah and her mother sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant, breathtaking oranges, pinks, and purples. Buster had taken up his usual position at the edge of the yard, his sleek silhouette distinct against the rapidly darkening landscape. You know, Helen said thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the bobcat. My grandfather used to tell stories about the old ranchers in this area who believed bobcats were special creatures. Not quite of this world. They said bobcats could see things humans couldn't, sense dangers before they even appeared. Sarah smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. That sounds like folklore, Mom. Of course it is, Helen agreed readily. But all folklore has its roots in observation, doesn't it? People notice something unusual, something extraordinary about these animals and created stories to explain it. She nodded toward Buster, a new respect in her eyes. Maybe there was more truth to those old tales than we modern scientific minds want to admit. As if aware he was being discussed, Buster turned his head slowly to look at them, his eyes reflecting the last, fading light of day, luminous and ancient. In the months that followed, life settled into a new, comfortable pattern. Buster recovered fully from his snake bite. The only physical reminder, a small patch of fur that grew back slightly lighter than the surrounding coat. Sarah, ever vigilant, installed additional snake barriers around the property and remained hyper-aware, her senses heightened during outdoor playtime with Daisy. Word of Buster's heroic act spread through the local wildlife rehabilitation community, with Dr. Adams even documenting the extraordinary case for a journal on animal behavior. Researchers from the nearby university expressed keen interest in observing Buster, hoping to better understand the complex cognition, the inner workings of his mind, that might have driven his protective behavior. Sarah permitted limited observation sessions, but remained fiercely protective of Buster's space and routine. She had no desire to see him treated merely as a research subject, rather than the complex, multifaceted being she had come to know and cherish. On warm evening, Sarah often sat on the porch, a sense of profound peace washing over her, watching Daisy toddle around the yard under her close, unwavering supervision. With Buster maintaining his characteristic, watchful presence nearby, a silent, golden-eyed guardian. The bobcat never sought affection in the conventional way of domestic pets. He didn't come when called, didn't enjoy being touched or petted, yet his consistent, steady presence had become a deep comfort, a quiet reassurance, a wild spirit who had chosen, in his own unique, mysterious way, to be a part of their family. You know, sometimes I wonder if you understand more than you let on. Sarah told him one evening, her voice soft, reflective, as Daisy played happily with blocks on a blanket nearby. What goes on in that wild, untamed mind of yours? Buster the bobcat blinked slowly at her, his expression as inscrutable, as unreadable as ever, yet somehow conveying a depth, an ancient wisdom that Sarah had never sensed in other wild animals. There would always be an unbridgeable gap between human understanding and wild animal consciousness. Sarah knew that, accepted it. Yet, in those golden, intelligent eyes, she sometimes caught fleeting glimpses of something profound, something truly extraordinary. A connection that transcended the usual, rigid boundaries between species. She would never fully, truly comprehend why Buster had risked his life to save Daisy that day. Perhaps it was some complex territorial instinct, a primal drive to protect his perceived territory and those within it. Or perhaps, just perhaps, something deeper, something that humans lacked the framework, the capacity to fully understand. What mattered, what was undeniably real, was the stark reality of what had happened. A wild creature had chosen, actively chosen, to protect a human child, forming a bond that defied conventional, scientific explanation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening, breathtaking shades of indigo and violet, Sarah watched Buster rise and stretch languidly, then moved to a spot closer to Daisy's blanket. The toddler looked up and smiled at him, an expression of pure, unadulterated joy, utterly unafraid of the wild predator that most children would, quite rightly, fear. "Buster," Daisy said clearly, her little voice a sweet melody, offering him a colorful block. The bobcat made no move to take it, of course, his wild nature asserting itself, but sat watching with that peculiar, intense focus that seemed reserved only for Daisy. In that simple, profound moment of connection between wild animal and human child, Sarah glimpsed something rare, something incredibly precious. A harmony, a perfect balance that most humans spent their lives searching for, but rarely, if ever, found. She had always believed her work in wildlife rehabilitation was solely about helping animals return to their natural, rightful place in the wild. Now, with Buster, she was discovering that sometimes, just sometimes, nature created its own unexpected connections, bridging worlds that seemed impossibly separate, impossibly far apart. In his own wild, mysterious way, Buster had found his place. Not in the forests where he had been born, where he belonged by all conventional measures, but here, with them, part of a family that defied easy definition, that was unconventional and unique, but was no less real, no less valid for its extraordinary uniqueness. As darkness settled, a soft blanket over the Arizona landscape, Sarah gathered Daisy, warm and sleepy, in her arms and headed toward the house. Buster followed, a silent, watchful presence at his customary distance. Different species, yes. Different worlds. Absolutely. Yet, bound together by an extraordinary, unforgettable moment of sacrifice that had changed all their lives forever. Behind them, the first tentative stars appeared in the twilight sky, watching over the unusual family. A mother, a child, and a wild, silent guardian who had crossed the ancient, invisible boundary between human and wilderness to save a life he had somehow, miraculously, come to cherish. Valuable lesson. This story teaches us that the bonds of family and love can transcend the conventional boundaries we place on them. It reminds us that wild animals, often driven by complex instincts we don't fully understand, can possess unexpected depths of connection and protective behavior, challenging our preconceived notions about the divide between the wild and the domesticated. True family isn't always defined by shared DNA, but by shared experiences, loyalty, and a willingness to protect those we care for, no matter how different they may seem. What did you think of Sarah and Buster's incredible story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this video on a scale of 1 to 10. Your feedback helps us create more stories you'll love. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next compelling narrative.